Hello, everyone. Welcome to FormFest, and welcome to this session on Forms and OmniStudio presented by Attain Partners. This afternoon or morning or whatever time it is where you are, um, I, myself, and my colleague Tom Kelleher will be discussing when to form tool and when to consider OmniStudio. So my name is Jamie Loeb. I'm a service delivery manager here at Attain Partners. And Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Great, thank you. So my name is Tom Kelleher. I'm a senior consultant here at Attain Partners. Been Salesforce consulting for higher ed now for probably about 15 years. I started my career at San Francisco State University here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and spent some time on the Salesforce.org Higher Education Advisory Council. But since then, I've had the privilege of working with many fantastic institutions across the country. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Tom is our higher ed expert. I work mostly with nonprofits because that's my background, and I will be acting, as you may have guessed, mostly as your MC/guide for this session. So what we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with an intro to OmniStudio, what it is, and almost more importantly, what it isn't. And we have a couple of use cases where we're going to put form tools like form assembly up against OmniStudio, see who comes out ahead. And then, of course, we have some time for Q&A. So, very brief overview. Tom, what is OmniStudio?
Oh gosh, see if I can summarize this succinctly enough. So OmniStudio, if no one is aware, was originally a product called Velocity that Salesforce acquired a few years ago. And they have since been integrating it into the core platform. It has a lot of traction, mostly in the industry clouds, which I think a lot of you are probably familiar with. I'm certainly seeing some familiar names in chat from the education vertical. But it is making its way into other industries as well, most notably things like financial services, manufacturing, and things of that nature. But OmniStudio is an interesting one. I would say, though it may appear to be a form or data collection tool on the surface, I would say it is absolutely not that underneath. I would probably describe OmniStudio as a WYSIWYG, if you're familiar with the term. So what you see is what you get. Declarative tool to build Lightning Web Components. So if that sounds a little interesting, it's because it is. It's certainly an advanced tool, if I'm frank. But it's made up of many parts, as products are wont to be, that do several things. So you have an OmniScript, which is the closest to what you may think of as a form tool. That would be where you can design a form, effectively, in a designer, in a declarative designer, not unlike a screen flow sort of creation page, where you are effectively just putting fields down and stringing it together, and with the intention of collecting that information. You also have flex cards, which are really small components that are designed to show other information from different systems. That could be from the CRM, that could be an external API. They're typically embedded in either OmniScripts or they can be placed on an experience site or in the CRM itself. They're used for displaying information predominantly. And then the other two primary components are integration procedures, which is really how you can move data in and out of the platform, right? You're integrating. And the last one is a data mapper, which used to be referred to as a data raptor.
I prefer
if you're old
Raptor.
enough to
It's
remember
more
that
fun.
now. Way more fun. They got it renamed to Data Mapper instead. But as it suggests, the Data Mapper is really sort of more of the transformational, the word, component, so that you can, not only just integrate and move data around, but you can make sure it's in the correct format, things of that nature. So beyond that, you have things like document generation, which are also a key part of OmniStudio. So you can create Word documents and PDF files. Of course, with all of the fun that comes with, collecting information from either the CRM or external sources and combining it together, not unlike a Conga or a DocuSign in that nature. And then you also have features around OmniOut, which is the ability to take an OmniScript or a flex card and place that on an external site with very specific requirements around that, to be completely frank. So
OmniStudio is a big complex tool. It does a lot, and some of the things it does is quite exciting. But as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, it requires a lot of pretty specific advanced knowledge. So this is not a tool that an accidental admin or a junior administrator could really be expected to work with.
Yeah, exactly. I would sort of come back to that point of this is a declarative tool that almost effectively is creating Lightning Web Components. So when I mentioned the form building components and part of the designer, you're literally just placing a field on a page. You have to be comfortable with JSON to be able to ensure that you're constructing the fields correctly, so that when you go to integrate or transform any of that data, you're calling the correct field names and the correct structure to pass that through. So yeah, as you said, this is not an accidental admin tool. This is more complex than that. And that's a big consideration to keep in mind.
And as you sort of alluded to, all of these different pieces of OmniStudio really need to work together. And so in order to use the tool effectively, you need someone to build and maintain it who understands the whole sort of what I'm going to call the tech stack of it, all the different pieces. So that's the gist of OmniStudio. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait, why are we thinking OmniStudio versus FormTool? And there's a couple of reasons. One reason is OmniStudio comes with EdCloud. And I think it will come with Nonprofit Cloud at some point. And so often there is a push from either leadership or someone within an organization to say, well, we have this, why don't we use this? Because it can't do that. So we're gonna sort of put these a little head to head to see how they stack up in some real life use cases that we've seen. And the first one is people need to request something from you. They need some information. They want to request a meeting. They need your services. Just a basic sort of request situation. So how do we figure out what direction to go in, Tom?
So the best way to think of these scenarios that we're going to go through is sort of a sliding scale of complexity. So as we're evaluating the request, and in this case in particular, what we're looking at is, effectively web to case, RFI form, something of that nature. You're collecting a little bit of information and you just want to get it into the CRM. You would be forgiven, I think, having seen some of the industry cloud demos and examples of what OmniStudio does, that it would be a form tool that you could just leverage for this. Not to say it's not a good tool, but this is what we want you to think about. So you're collecting only a little bit of information. You only want a couple of fields. Sounds easy. So you're comparing a form tool to OmniStudio, and it comes back to that thought of if I'm using OmniStudio, I'm going to need a resource that understands how to leverage OmniStudio with the JSON and the integration procedures and the data mappers to just construct it, but then also to maintain it. So this is that can quickly become a bottleneck in the future. And at least in my experience, when someone says, oh, can we just throw an RFI form on the website? We just want to, names and emails. That sounds great, but then often that's handed off to the accidental admin, right? And that's where I think that complexity really is important to think about. You've got a couple of things you're collecting. It's very straightforward, not very complex. You would be well served, due to the complexity, to consider a form tool first before moving into the complexity of OmniStudio, purely down to the maintenance of that in the future, in my opinion, right?
Yeah. So we have some specific questions that people can sort of ask themselves as they're making this decision. But it really comes down to a question of, it's one of those, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And so essentially what you're asking is, if we have this hammer of OmniStudio, is this actually a nail we're looking at? And these are the kinds of questions here on the slide, which you will be able to download after the fact, that you can ask yourself to try and figure that out.
Right.
So you talked a little bit about the complexity of the data, and on the slide we have here also the complexity of the business logic. Does the type of data you're collecting come into this?
Absolutely. Right. So again, choose the example of an RFI form, right? First name, last name, email. You're either going to be putting that into lead, hopefully it's the intended place, but maybe you're going to account and contact or person account. In this example, right, very simple use case, you're probably only putting in 3 points of data into a standard object, into a single standard object. That sounds easy with a form tool. But with OmniStudio, that would quickly become, I will affectionately say double the effort, right? Because you're going to have to build the form, and then you have to build what is effectively your own connector, because you're going to integration procedure, and you're going to have to do the mapping. And that's just for the 3 basic things. If you're subject to regulatory requirements, FERPA, HIPAA, anything of that nature, you would obviously have to choose carefully. Does your form tool support those integrations? Do you have the right version of that? Are you trying to upload documents? Do you need e-signatures? Do you have to call external APIs? Do you have to have multiple pages of forms? So that's where the data is going to really inform how complex that form creation ends up being.
So generally in this first showdown, when we're talking about a request for information kind of situation, the winner is probably a form tool, with the asterisk of these things can start simple and then balloon into something that is complex enough to consider OmniStudio, especially when there are complex compliance issues to consider. So that leads us to our next showdown, our next use case, applications. People are applying to be part of a program, they're applying to a school, they're applying for a scholarship. Applications, whatever they're applying for, applications themselves can be complicated. So complexity is, again, our #1 concern. Tell us more, Tom.
So this is a case in this scenario where I would forgive you if you're just looking at an Education Cloud demo as the example. They have a really great application that is purpose-built out of the box for a solution called Common App. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. but it looks like something of a holy grail to a lot of people. Look at that great form. It collects everything we need. That form is actually a lot more complex than it looks
I
like.
think we need air quotes.
Yeah, right.
Form.
That OmniScript, let's put it
There
that
you
way,
go.
is a lot more complicated than it looks like. So when you're talking about something that's this complex, right, you're applying to a program, you're very likely going to have not just sort of a form that's paginated, right, where you're just collecting lots of things, but the information you're collecting really informs all of the subsequent fields or data points that you're collecting. I think when we were talking earlier, we were describing it sort of as, go sit down in the doctor's office and they give you a clipboard and you've got 5 pieces of paper you're supposed to fill in. And you're kind of going through and, do you have any of these conditions? And then you say yes to one. And now all of a sudden I have to fill in 3 more pieces of paper. That's the sort of complexity that I think best describes what the Education Cloud example shows, but also the level of complexity that I think you would be inherent with this kind of form, right? So you're collecting information that will go to multiple objects that may require automations to run in sort of very specific scenarios, right? So many form tools will have connectors, but you may not have the control over, what order they go in or how quickly they go in. Do they go in batches or things of that nature, right? So that's where, OmniStudio would win out. And what the OmniScript then can do is sort of guide you through step by step through the process. And it can sort of change and, adjust as you go through it, depending on what you're asking. So obviously then, if you add to that what we were talking about before, how complex is the data? How many objects are you putting into it? Are you required by any regulations to consider PII? All of that sort of informs that complexity. So in this example, where you've got lots of information collecting, lots of logic that's driving how that information is being collected and what's done with it, in this scenario, generally speaking, I think OmniStudio is the preferred choice.
For those of you who are not acronym nerds, PII is personally identifiable information. And so form tools like form assembly often have very granularly customizable connectors and logic from how to get from one question to the other. And so it would seem like, if you're a longtime user of form assembly, you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait, I could do that with form assembly. So where is that sort of dividing line of complexity?
I'll give you the really annoying consulting answer, which is it depends, right? So that's absolutely a business decision that you'd have to make, because obviously, if you've got OmniStudio, I think as you said, the inclination is going to be, well, we paid for this thing, why aren't we using it?
Absolutely.
And now you have to have that conversation. What am I collecting? Where does it have to go? What automations? Do I need a document generated at the end of it? Does a form tool cover all of those things and then warrant the added cost? You might get some of those features from some tools or some plans with those tools, but it might necessitate a far more expensive enterprise plan or not. I don't know. But that's sort of part of what you would have to decide. And I think maybe more importantly, what does your team look like, right? Do you have resources that are technical enough to work with OmniStudio? And to sort of play on that, do you have resources that are going to be free enough, right, to maintain those forms? Because just making it once is great, but I've done enough marketing in my days to know in a week I'm going to get asked to add a different field to that RFI form, And that sounds easy to my, my management, but to, if you're doing it in OmniStudio, now you have to make a whole new version and you have to make sure it's all mapped correctly and that nothing's breaking.
Right.
Whereas in a form tool, it's like, okay, great, I can just go in, drag a new form on there, and connect that. So those are some of the things that I would strongly consider, right? How complex is the data? What regulations? What are you doing with it? And then what does your team look like? And what does that cost structure look like? So there's a different answer for everybody else. So it's going to be, and it depends.
As we were discussing this earlier, you had mentioned, I think, a really good example of often you go in and start building a form thinking, oh, this is going to be simple. And next thing you know, you've got 500 questions and 3,000 conditionals and 5 different connectors running. And while that may all work, I think it then becomes an open question as to, is that actually easier than OmniStudio? If you have the resources who can do the OmniStudio work, is it as reliable given the load you're throwing at it, right? So those become questions when you end up with these forms that become so complex that it's sort of aesthetically offensive, for lack of a better way of describing it.
Yeah. And then there are going to be considerations around product compatibility as well, right? Form tools, super easy, shove it into an object and it's going to do what it's going to do. OmniStudio is a little bit of a different beast. It's still being integrated. It is a large managed package. Sometimes it can feel a little slow, but that's not, it's not to say it's a bad thing. It's just, there are considerations with how do they work and what do they work with as well.
So the basic answer to OmniStudio versus Form Tool is, of course, it depends, because Tom and I are consultants. And so that's always our answer. But I hope we've given you some ideas on how to figure out which side of that complexometer you're on. And now we have some time for questions. And I should say, for those of you who don't know Attain Partners, while you're typing your questions into the chat, Attain Partners is a full service consulting firm. Obviously, we have a Salesforce practice that Tom and I are both part of. We do implementations, we do managed services. We also do design thinking, change management, research administration, a pretty wide range of consulting services. We work with higher ed and nonprofit and hospital systems. So that's our focus, and that's what's driving, what Tom and I have seen that have led us to these sort of these examples that we've been using. So if you have questions, now is a great time to put them in the chat. I see one about getting a recording. It will be available after the fact. I believe our producer, Josh, has more details. Any other questions? Tom, I guess we got all the information going. All right.
I was impressed with what you two covered. I wanted to join just very quickly and back up what you said, Jamie. The recording of this session and other user conference sessions will be available early next week. And as Jamie mentioned, the resources section of this webinar also has the slides available for download, and as well as some other links. So I'll leave you to it.
Oh, we've got a new question from Bill. Are there any examples of reasons why a user should choose the complexity of OmniStudio over a form tool? So I think we generally, both Tom and I as humans and sort of Attain Partners generally, take the stance of we generally want to design the simplest solution that will do what you need it to do. Right? So we always want to match the complexity of the solution and the tool to the complexity of the actual needs. So the reasons why you might start moving towards the complexity of OmniStudio, as Tom has said, have to do with the complexity of the data, the complexity of what literally needs to happen, in terms of business logic while someone is filling out a form, the complexity of where the data goes. I don't think we mentioned this, but if you're collecting data that needs to go somewhere outside of Salesforce via API, usually that will push you towards an OmniStudio type of solution. Anything to add to that, Tom?
Yeah, I think there are also things to consider that, due to the complexity, right? Again, so think of it as you're building Lightning Web Components. So maybe an example would be we've worked with a school that's using OmniStudio to pull back information based on input, right? So you have what you might think is a form, and then what they're doing is actually pulling back information from Blackboard, which if people don't remember what that is, it's a learning management system online. So we're able to then include that as part of an OmniScript or a Flex card to pull back course information as part of, again, what you might think of as a form. So it sort of comes back again to that complexity, right? So if you're trying to do something like that, where maybe the user puts some input in and then it pulls back course information from an LMS or something like that, it's an external system. Those are just things that most form tools would struggle probably to do, probably outside of their scope. But that's where OmniStudio shines. It's that declarative Lightning Web Component approach. So hopefully that's something the business can decide, right? Is this a form? Is this a simple form? Or is this something more complex?
Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't live in Salesforce land, a Lightning Web Component is an interface widget of some kind, or could be a whole page, could be a widget, that is essentially built with custom code. That is built with custom code. It's not what you see, but it allows you to be very custom with exactly what data is there, what the interface looks like, all of that kinds of things. Imagine dropping like a mini HTML web page into your CRM or on your Experience Cloud site, except it's not HTML, but it's related. So what Tom is pointing to is just you're building these things declaratively, but under the hood is custom code. So that adds to the level of complexity. All right, well, we've got 2 minutes. Any last questions? Anyone? Okay, well, if you think of a question 20 minutes from now, 2 weeks from now, you can find us at the Attain website. Tom and I are both pretty active on LinkedIn as well. If you spell our names right, you should find us. We do have another one. I've heard that OmniStudio has a steep learning curve, even for developers. How would you describe the effort it takes to actually be able to leverage OmniStudio? Megan, I think you have heard correct. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that that sort of scale of complexity is sort of a hockey stick or a bathtub, right? So it goes, you've got your form tools, maybe you've got your flow, and then all of a sudden you've got OmniStudio, and then you've got all the way up here custom code. So it's definitely not an admin tool, not an accidental admin or like a junior admin. You're going to at least want an admin that's probably had about 5 years of experience, right? They really know the platform. They've probably dabbled in some code. They know what it is, and they probably are comfortable with things like JSON or can learn it. But it is complex, particularly, frankly, if it breaks, right? That's when you're really going to want to start dusting off your developer skills to debug.
Right. All right. So as I said, you can find us out in the world through the Attain website, through LinkedIn. So you can also download this presentation to use as a kind of guide for as you go off and try to make decisions. We also have a blog article on our site that might be interesting to some of you about moving from Student to Success Hub, which is an older Salesforce product, to Education Cloud with OmniStudio. Not directly about form tools per se, but about that process and what you should consider. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Tom, for all of your brilliant insights. And thank you to Form Assembly for inviting us.